Hi, I'm Danielle and I'm reading the tale of Peter Rabbit. Once upon a time there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Miss Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there and he was put into a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out." Then old Miss Rabbit took her basket and her umbrella and went to the woods to the baker's. She bought a loaf of bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down to the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. He first ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. And then, after feeling rather sick, he looked for some parsley. But around the end of the cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages. But then he jumped up and ran after Peter, raving awake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten his way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes amongst the cabbages and another amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran out on 4 legs and went faster, so I think he might have gotten away altogether, but if not, unfortunately, he ran into a gooseberry net and got caught by the buttons on his jacket. It was the blue jacket with the brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows who grew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. But Mr. McGregor jumped up with the sieve and intended to pop on top of Peter, but Peter reeled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him. He rushed to the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if not had so much water in it. But Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps underneath the flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each one. Presently, Peter sneezed, "Hachoo!" and Mr. McGregor was after him in no time. And he tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out a window, upsetting 3 tree plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, though, and he was tired of running after Peter, so he went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright. He had not the least idea which way to go. He was also very damp with sitting in that can. After he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, but not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in the wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over some stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her which way was to the gate, but she had a large pea in her mouth and she could not answer. She only shook her head at him, and Peter began to cry. He then tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish, and she sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail would twitch as if it were alive. Peter thought it would be best to go away without speaking to her. He heard about cats from his cousins, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scritch, scratch, scritch, scratch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes, but presently, as if nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter. Beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could, going along the straight walk behind some blackcurrant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him from the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was saved at last in the woods outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and shoes for the scarecrow to frighten the little blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him until he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired, and he flopped down upon the nice soft sand of the wood floor and the rabbit hole and to shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking and wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I'm sorry to say that Peter was not doing very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made him some cameline tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoon should be taken at night bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper.